He sold more than 1 billion records. His home, Graceland, is the second most visited private residence in America, right after the White House. The decades after his death, his estate still earns millions of dollars every year. His face is one of the most recognizable on the planet. From the outside, Elvis Presley was not just the king of rock and roll. He was the king of a financial empire. But the truth is a lot stranger. When Elvis died on August 16th, 1977, he was on the edge of financial ruin. The man who earned what would be billions in today's money left behind an estate worth a surprisingly small amount, burdened by debt and managed by a man who took half of everything. How does that happen? How does the biggest star in the world end up worried about money? The story of Elvis's finances is not one of a savvy businessman. It is a story of incredible earnings, reckless spending, and breathtaking exploitation. It is a story that makes you shake your head and ask, where did it all go wrong? Number 15. Why did he pay so many people to just hang around? And Elvis Presley was a lonely man. He was the most famous person in the world, but he was isolated by that fame. To combat this, he surrounded himself with a group of friends, family, and employees that became known as the Memphis Mafia. This was not a gang. It was an entourage. And it was a massive constant drain on his bank account. These were the people who lived with him, traveled with him, and protected him from the outside world. Their job, for the most part, was simply to be there. And Elvis paid for everything. The core group included people like his cousin, Sonny, and Red West, his spiritual advisor, Larry Geller, and his foreman, Joe Esposito. At any given time, there could be a dozen or more men on his personal payroll. He paid them weekly salaries. These were not huge by today's standards, maybe a few $100s a week. But he also paid for their homes, their cars, their clothes, and their family's expenses. If one of them needed a new refrigerator, Elvis bought it. If their kid needed braces, Elvis paid for it. He bought them all matching jewelry and gave them lavish Christmas bonuses, often in the tens of thousands of dollars. The total cost was staggering. In the book Elvis and Me, Priscilla Presley described how the household bills at Graceland could run up to $500,000 a year in the 1970s. That is the equivalent of several $1,000,000 today. A huge portion of that went to supporting the Memphis Mafia. They were not business associates who helped him generate income, they were a personal expense. Think about it like a company having a department that does nothing but keep the CEO happy. It generates no revenue, but its costs are enormous. This arrangement was documented extensively in books written by former members, most famously Elvis What Happened, by Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler. While that book focused on Elvis's personal decline, it also painted a clear picture of the financial ecosystem around him. They described a life of incredible luxury, all funded by Elvis. They would have spontaneous trips to Las Vegas or Vail. Elvis would rent out entire movie theaters or amusement parks for them for a night. He did not just pay their salaries, he funded their entire lifestyle. Why did he do it? It was not a business decision, it was an emotional one. Peter Guralnick, in his definitive biography, Careless Love, The Unmaking of Elvis Presley, explains that Elvis needed this buffer. He craved the normality of having his buddies around. They were his link to his past in Memphis before he became a global icon. They played football with him, rode horses, and just sat around talking. But this emotional security blanket came at a steep price. He was supporting dozens of people. The financial advisors that his father, Vernon Presley, occasionally brought in were horrified. They saw a massive, uncontrolled outflow of cash with no return. They would suggest budgets and payroll cuts. Elvis would listen, nod, and then ignore them completely. He could not or would not fire his friends. To him, it would be like cutting off a part of himself. So the spending continued year after year. The salaries, the bonuses, the cars, the houses, it all added up, a slow and steady leak from a fortune that everyone assumed was bottomless. But it was not. What do we still not know about this? Did anyone ever calculate the exact total cost of the Memphis Mafia over the 2 decades it existed? How much would that money be worth today if it had been invested instead? Were any members of the entourage secretly feeding financial information back to his manager, Colonel Tom Parker? And did Elvis ever, in a quiet moment, resent the financial burden of his own loneliness? Number 14 was giving away. Cadillac's a form of financial self-sabotage. Or Elvis Presley's generosity was legendary. It was also a massive financial problem. He seemed to get a genuine deep joy from giving things away. He gave away jewelry, cash, and homes. But his signature gift was a brand new Cadillac. If he liked you, if you did something nice for him, or if he just felt like it, you could end up with the keys to a luxury car. This was not a rare occurrence. It happened all the time. One of the most famous stories took place in a Memphis Cadillac dealership in 1975. A bank teller named Many Person was admiring a Cadillac but knew she could never afford it. Elvis, who was there buying a car for himself, saw her. He asked her which one she liked. He then wrote a check and gave her the car. This was a complete stranger. The story made the news, but it was just one of many. He bought cars for his inner circle, his cook, his doctor, and sometimes people he just met. Estimates suggest he gave away over 100 Cadillacs in his lifetime. Let's think about the numbers. In the mid-1970s, a new Cadillac could cost around $10,000. That is like $50,000 in today's money. If he gave away 100 of them, that is $1 million in 1970s money. In today's value, that is at least $5 million spent just on cars for other people. And that is a conservative estimate. It does not include the other cars, the jewelry, or the houses. He once bought a house for his maid, a woman named Mary Jenkins, as detailed in her own memoir, Elvis, The Final Years. He simply felt she deserved a better place to live. This was not strategic philanthropy. It was impulsive, emotional spending on a grand scale. His father, Vernon, who was supposed to be in charge of the finances, was constantly trying to rein him in. In the documentary Elvis the Searcher, you can see the conflict. Vernon was a man who grew up in poverty during the Great Depression. He saw Elvis's spending as reckless, but Elvis had a different view. He once told his friend George Klein, "I get more pleasure out of giving a car to someone than I do from getting one myself." This generosity was part of his identity, but from a financial perspective, it was a disaster. It was unbudgeted and unpredictable. An accountant cannot plan for a client who might suddenly spend the equivalent of $500,000 on a whim. This impulsive giving was a symptom of a larger problem. Elvis had no real concept of a budget. Money was an abstract thing to him. He earned so much of it so quickly that it did not feel real. He saw it as a tool to create happiness for himself and for others. The problem was his income was not infinite and his expenses were growing. The cost of maintaining Graceland, the Memphis Mafia, his own lifestyle, and his habit of giving things away was starting to outpace his earnings, especially in the mid-1970s when he was not making hit records as consistently. The book Elvis Presley, A Southern Life by Joel Williamson touches on this complex psychology. Elvis's poverty in childhood created a deep-seated need to prove he was successful, and giving away lavish gifts was the ultimate proof. It was a way of saying, I have so much, it means nothing to me. But in reality, it was starting to mean a lot to his bottom line. He was giving away his capital, the very money he would need for his future. So, what are the unanswered questions here? Is there a complete list of every major gift Elvis ever gave? What was the total inflation-adjusted value of his lifetime generosity? Did Colonel Parker ever try to stop him, or did he see it as good publicity and just another expense to be covered? And how much faster did this habit accelerate his slide towards financial trouble in his final years? Number 13, could he really afford his own private jet? In 1975, Elvis Presley bought a used Convair 880 jet for $250,000. It was a former Delta Airlines plane. He then spent close to $1 million refurbishing it. He named it the Lisa Marie, after his daughter. It was the ultimate rock star accessory. It had a queen-size bed, a conference room, a private bathroom with gold-plated fixtures, and a high-end sound system. It was his flying palace. It was also a financial black hole. The purchase itself was just the beginning. The real cost of a private jet is not buying it, it is keeping it. A plane like the Lisa Marie was designed for commercial airline use. It was a gas guzzler. The fuel costs alone were astronomical. Then there was the cost of the crew. Elvis had to employ a full-time pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer. They were on call 24/7. There was also maintenance, insurance, and hangar fees. Estimates from aviation experts suggest that the annual operating costs for a jet of that size in that era would have been, at a minimum, several $100,000. That is millions per year in today's money. He used the jet to fly to his concerts in Las Vegas and on tour. But he also used it for fun, There is a famous story confirmed by members of his entourage, like his friend Jerry Schilling, about flying from Memphis to Denver and back in the middle of the night just to get a specific sandwich, the Fool's Gold Loaf. The trip likely cost thousands of dollars in fuel for a sandwich. This story perfectly illustrates the financial recklessness. The jet was a toy, and he used it like one. This spending came at a terrible time. By 1975, Elvis's health was declining. His record sales were not what they used to be. His primary source of income was grueling live performances. He was working himself to the bone just to maintain this incredibly expensive lifestyle. The Lisa Marie was not a business asset that helped him make more money. It was a luxury he could not truly afford, at least not without constantly being on the road. In her book Elvis and Me, Priscilla Presley wrote about his spending. She described it as impulsive and driven by a desire to have the best of everything. The jet was the ultimate example. He also bought other smaller jets, like a Lockheed Jetstar. The combined cost of his private air force was a constant massive drain on his cash flow. Vernon Presley, his father, was reportedly furious about the purchase of the Lisa Marie. He saw it as a completely unnecessary extravagance that was putting the family's finances at risk. The financial documents from his estate, which became public after his death, showed the strain. He had huge income, but his expenses were almost as big. The jets were a significant part of those expenses. They represented a fundamental misunderstanding of wealth. Elvis confused cash flow with net worth. As long as money was coming in, he felt rich, but he was not building lasting wealth. He was spending his income as fast as it arrived, and the Lisa Marie was one of the fastest ways to do it. What remains a mystery about this? What were the exact itemized annual operating costs of the Lisa Marie and his other jets? Did any financial advisor create a report showing him how much the planes were costing him versus how much he was earning? Did Colonel Parker approve of the purchase, or was he against it? And if Elvis had not bought the jets, would he have been financially secure at the time of his death? Number 12, why was a Hollywood megastar paid like a B-lister? Between 1956 and 1969, Elvis Presley starred in 31 feature films. They were, for the most part, terrible. They were formulaic musicals with weak plots, but they made a lot of money. Elvis was one of the biggest box office draws of the 1960s, so you would assume he was one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood. You would be wrong. Elvis's movie deals were structured in a way that benefited the studio and his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, far more than they benefited him. In the early days, his salary was respectable, but as his box office power grew, his salary did not grow with it. For most of the 1960s, he was earning a flat fee of around $1 million per movie. That sounds like a lot, but it was not for a star of his caliber. Elizabeth Taylor was earning that much for a single film, Cleopatra, in the early 60s, and she also got a percentage of the gross profits. Marlon Brando and Frank Sinatra were commanding similar deals. Elvis never got a percentage of the profits. He got his salary, and that was it. The studios kept all the box office revenue after that. And the movies were incredibly profitable. They were made on shoestring budgets, often for less than $1 million. In a film like Blue Hawaii, for example, was a massive hit. It made a fortune for Paramount Pictures. Elvis got his standard fee. He made the studio rich, but he did not share in that wealth. Why were his deals so bad? The answer is Colonel Tom Parker. Parker's strategy was all about guaranteed money and low risk. He did not want to gamble on a percentage of the profits. He wanted a check up front. This approach came from his background as a carny and a promoter. He was not a Hollywood insider. He did not understand the art of the deal in the same way that agents at William Morris did. As detailed in Alana Nash's biography, The Colonel, The Extraordinary Story of Colonel Tom Parker and Elvis Presley, Parker's main goal was to secure his own 50% commission. A simple flat fee deal was easy to calculate and easy to split. Parker also controlled the soundtracks. He negotiated a deal where Elvis's record label, RCA, would have to pay the movie studio a fee to release the soundtrack album. This was backward. Normally, a studio would want the soundtrack to be a hit to promote the movie. But Parker had created a system where every part of the Elvis machine was paying every other part, and he was taking a cut from all of it. The quality of the songs in the movies suffered. Elvis was forced to sing terrible songs like Do the Clam because they were part of the movie package deal Parker had signed. Elvis hated it. He wanted to be a serious actor. He had shown real promise in his early films like King Creole, but Parker pushed him into the safe, profitable formula pictures. By the mid-1960s, Elvis was miserable. He felt like a joke. He was a multi-talented artist trapped in a creative and financial cage. He was earning less than his peers, making movies he despised, all because his manager preferred a safe, easy payday over a more lucrative but complex deal. He was a box office king who was being paid like a prince. What are the lingering questions? How much more money could Elvis have earned if he had received just a 10% share of the gross profits from his most successful films? Was there ever a moment where another agent or manager tried to represent Elvis and offer him a better deal? Did the movie studio executives know they were getting a bargain, and did they ever discuss it among themselves? And what was the true opportunity cost of those years? Not just financially, but for his artistic legacy. Number 11, did he get robbed on all that cheap merchandise? Elvis Presley was one of the first artists to be merchandised on a massive scale. In the 1950s, you could buy Elvis lipstick, Elvis teddy bears, Elvis scarves, and Elvis guitars. His image was everywhere. This was a new frontier for the music business, and it was incredibly lucrative. It generated millions of dollars in revenue. The problem was, very little of that money actually made it to Elvis. The man in charge of all merchandising was, of course, Colonel Tom Parker. He set up a company called Elvis Presley Enterprises to handle the deals. Parker's approach to merchandising was simple license, everything to anyone who would pay. He was not concerned with quality control or brand image. He just wanted to maximize the number of products out there. This led to a flood of cheap, tacky items. This is documented in the book Elvis and the Colonel by Dirk Valenga. Parker's office was flooded with samples of junk, and he approved almost all of it. The financial structure of these deals was heavily skewed in Parker's favor. First, the licensing company, run by a man named Hank Saperstein, would take a large cut. Then what was left was split between Elvis and the Colonel, but it was not a 50-50 split in the way you might think. After all the expenses and cuts were taken out, Elvis's share of the merchandising fortune was surprisingly small. Some reports suggest his take was as low as 20% of the total retail revenue. This was happening at the peak of his early fame, from 1956 to 1958. During this period, Elvis merchandise reportedly generated over $22 million in sales. That is over $200 million in today's money. It was a gold mine, but Elvis was busy making records and movies. He was not involved in the business side. He trusted the Colonel completely. He had no idea how much money was being made or how little of it he was actually receiving. The lack of quality control also had a long-term cost. It cheapened his image. While the Beatles would later carefully manage their brand, Elvis's brand was attached to anything and everything. This might have seemed harmless at the time, but it set a precedent. The focus was always on the quick buck, not on building a lasting, high-quality brand. This philosophy would continue for the rest of his career. When Elvis went into the army in 1958, the merchandising machine slowed down. When he came back, the focus shifted to movies. But the early merchandising boom was a massive missed opportunity. It was a blueprint for how an artist's brand could be monetized, but it was also a cautionary tale about how that brand could be exploited by the people meant to be protecting it. The money was real, but Elvis's share of it was not. He was the face on the lunchbox, but someone else was cashing the checks. What are the things we still don't fully understand? Are the financial records from the original Elvis Presley Enterprises from the 1950s still in existence, and what do they truly reveal? How much did Hank Saperstein's company actually make from the deals? Did Elvis ever question why he was seeing so little money from so many products? And how did this early experience shape Colonel Parker's financial strategy for the rest of Elvis's career? Number 10, how did his dream home almost bankrupt his estate? Graceland was Elvis Presley's sanctuary. He bought the Memphis mansion in 1957 for about $100,000. It was his home, his fortress, and the center of his universe. He loved it. But during his lifetime, Graceland was not an asset. It was a massive financial liability. After he died, it almost had to be sold. The problem was the upkeep. Graceland is a large house on a large piece of property. The cost of running it was enormous. There were property taxes, utilities, insurance, and the salaries of a full-time staff, including cooks, maids, and groundskeepers. On top of that, Elvis was constantly redecorating and adding to it. He built the famous jungle room, the racquetball court, and made other expensive upgrades. As mentioned before, Priscilla Presley estimated the annual running costs in the 1970s at around $500,000. That is $500,000 a year every year just to keep the lights on and the staff paid. This was money that was not being invested, it was just being spent. For Elvis, this was the cost of having his private world. But for his estate, it became a crisis. When Elvis died in 1977, his estate was in a precarious position. He had some assets, but he also had huge expenses, and the biggest one was Graceland. The estate had to continue paying for the upkeep of the mansion, but the primary source of income, Elvis himself, was gone. The estate was facing a massive inheritance tax bill from the IRS. The costs were mounting, and the income was drying up. The executors of the estate, including Elvis's father Vernon, were faced with a terrible choice: sell Graceland or find a new way to make it pay for itself. Vernon died in 1979, leaving Priscilla Presley as one of the key trustees. At this point, the estate was nearly broke. The annual cost of maintaining Graceland was threatening to consume what little was left. This is all detailed in Priscilla's own autobiography and in numerous financial reports from the time. The dream home had become a nightmare for his heirs. It was Priscilla who came up with the idea to open Graceland to the public. She hired a team of business managers and museum experts. They saw the potential. They invested what was left of the estate's money into turning the private home into a tourist attraction. It was a huge gamble. If it failed, the estate would be bankrupt and Graceland would have to be sold to developers. The gamble paid off. Graceland opened for tours in 1982. It was an instant success. It started generating millions of dollars a year. It saved the estate. It turned Elvis's biggest liability into his greatest asset. Today, it is the cornerstone of a business empire, but it is important to remember that for the 20 years Elvis lived there and for the first 5 years after his death, Graceland was a financial drain that contributed significantly to his money problems and almost wiped out his legacy. What questions are still unanswered? What was the total amount of money Elvis spent on Graceland, including the purchase price, renovations, and 20 years of upkeep in today's dollars? Were there ever serious offers from developers to buy the property after his death, and for how much? Well, what would have happened to his legacy if Graceland had been torn down and turned into a shopping center? And did Elvis himself ever view the house as a financial burden, or did he only ever see it as his home? Number 9. Was the King of Vegas's just a highly paid employee? In 1969, Elvis Presley returned to live performing with a series of shows at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. It was a triumphant comeback. He was a sensation. For the next 7 years, he performed over 600 sold-out shows there. He became synonymous with Las Vegas. The money was incredible. He was earning a reported $125,000 a week. This seems like a king's ransom. But when you look closer at the deal, it raises questions about who was really in charge. The Las Vegas contract was negotiated by Colonel Tom Parker, and like the movie deals, it was structured for simplicity and a guaranteed payday. Elvis was essentially a salaried employee of the hotel. He was paid his weekly fee to perform 2 shows a night, 7 days a week, for a month-long engagement. He did this multiple times a year. The hotel, in return, made a fortune. They made money on the ticket sales, but the real profit came from the casino. And Elvis was the ultimate lure. He brought thousands of high rollers into the building every night. They came to see the king, and they stayed to gamble. The hotel was getting an incredible deal. They were paying Elvis a flat fee, but they were reaping a much larger and unquantifiable reward in gambling revenue. And Elvis, once again, did not have a percentage of the profits. He did not get a cut of the casino's take. He did not own a piece of the hotel. He was just the hired help, albeit very well-paid hired help. The workload was brutal. 2 shows a night is physically and vocally demanding. The schedule was relentless. This is the period when Elvis's dependence on prescription drugs began to escalate dramatically. As documented in Guralnick's Careless Love, he needed drugs to get him up for the show and drugs to bring him down so he could sleep. The job was literally killing him. He was trading his health for a paycheck, and a huge chunk of that paycheck was not even his. Colonel Parker took his 50% cut. The government took its share in taxes. The costs of the band, the backup singers, and the travel for his entourage also came out of his share. When you break it down, Elvis was working himself to death for a fraction of the money he was generating for the hotel and his manager. The Las Vegas years represent the core of the Elvis financial tragedy. He was at the peak of his power as a live performer, a true cultural phenomenon. The demand was limitless. A different kind of manager might have used that leverage to negotiate a partnership, a share of the casino profits, or even part ownership in a venue. But Parker was not that kind of manager. He stuck to his simple, safe, flat fee formula. Elvis was the star attraction, but he was not the owner. He was working in a kingdom that was making other people rich while he was just collecting a salary. What are the financial details we still wish we knew? Did the International Hotel ever conduct a study on how much extra gambling revenue Elvis's shows generated for the casino? How did Elvis's weekly salary compare to what other major stars, like Frank Sinatra, were earning in Vegas at the time on a per-show basis? Did Parker ever even attempt to negotiate for a percentage of the gate or other revenues? And what was the true cost to Elvis's health, and how can that be measured against the money he earned? Number 8. Why did he sell his entire past for a quick payday? In 1973, a landmark deal was made. Elvis Presley sold the royalty rights to his entire back catalog of recordings made before that date to his record company, RCA. The deal was for a lump sum payment of $5,400,000. In exchange, Elvis would receive no future royalties for the sales of classic songs like Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, Jailhouse Rock, and Can't Help Falling in Love. He sold his musical legacy for a one-time check. It is considered one of the worst deals in music history. Why would he do this? The decision was driven by two things: a need for immediate cash and the advice of Colonel Tom Parker. By 1973, Elvis's finances were stretched. He had just gone through an expensive divorce from Priscilla. He owed back taxes to the IRS. And his lifestyle with Graceland, the Jets, and the entourage was as expensive as ever. The $5,400,000 seemed like a solution to his short-term money problems. From Colonel Parker's perspective, the deal was a stroke of genius for him. First, he got his 50% commission immediately. That was a quick $2,700,000 for him. Second, it simplified his accounting. He no longer had to worry about tracking complicated royalty statements from hundreds of old songs. He preferred lump sums. It was clean. It was easy. Alana Nash's book, The Colonel, goes into great detail about Parker's thinking. He was not interested in long-term asset management. He was interested in immediate cash flow. The problem is that he sold the Golden Goose. Those songs were timeless. They would continue to sell for decades, forever. Every time one of those songs was played on the radio, used in a movie, or sold on a compilation album, RCA would make money, and Elvis would get nothing. The value of that catalog over the last 50 years is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. He traded a future fortune for a present-day pittance. To put it in perspective, other artists from that era, like Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen, have recently sold their catalogs for hundreds of millions of dollars. Those deals were for the publisher's share and the writer's share. Elvis's deal was for his artist royalties, which is a different stream of income, but the principle is the same. He gave up a recurring, lifelong income stream for a single payment. It was the financial equivalent of taking a small buyout of your pension when you are 40 years old. It solves a problem today, but creates a much bigger one for tomorrow. This deal reveals the fundamental flaw in Elvis's financial management. It was all about the short term. There was no long-range planning, no concept of building wealth or managing assets. It was about getting enough money to cover the massive expenses for the next year. And Elvis, who was only 38 at the time, probably did not understand the full implications. He trusted the colonel. He needed the money. So he signed the papers. It was a catastrophic financial mistake that cost his estate an unimaginable amount of money. What are the remaining questions about this terrible deal? Did anyone from RCA or any outside lawyer try to warn Elvis or his father about how bad the deal was in the long run? How was the $5,400,000 figure arrived at, and what was the catalog's estimated value at the time? How much money has that pre-1973 catalog generated for RCA since the deal was made? And did Elvis, in the last 4 years of his life, ever express regret for selling his musical birthright? Number 7. Where did all the money go before he died? Elvis Presley earned an estimated $100 million during his lifetime. In today's money, that is well over $1 billion. Yet, when he died on August 16, 1977, his estate was valued at a shockingly low figure, somewhere between $5 and $10 million. And it was in debt. The IRS presented the estate with a tax bill that threatened to wipe out most of what was left. So, the big question is, where did it all go? The answer is a combination of all the factors we have discussed. It was not one thing, it was everything. First, there was the split with Colonel Tom Parker. For every dollar Elvis earned, 50 cents went straight to the colonel. So, that $1 billion lifetime earning is immediately cut in half. We are down to $500 million. Next come the taxes. Elvis was in the highest tax bracket. The top marginal tax rate in the 1960s and 70s was extremely high, sometimes over 70%. A huge portion of his share went directly to the government. So let's take another 50% or more off the top. We are now down to maybe $200 million or less over a 20-year career. Now, we have the expenses, and his expenses were astronomical. There was the cost of Graceland, a $500,000 a year liability. There was the payroll for the Memphis Mafia, another few $100,000 a year. There was his own lavish spending on cars, clothes, and jewelry. There was his legendary generosity, giving away millions in cars and gifts. There was the cost of his private jets, another massive annual expense. There was the expensive divorce settlement with Priscilla. All these costs added up, year after year. He was living a life that even his massive income could barely support. The financial records of his estate, which were analyzed in the book Elvis, Money, and the Man by Bill Bram, show an artist with a huge income but almost no savings or investments. The money came in and the money went out. He was living paycheck to paycheck, except his paychecks were enormous, and so were his bills. There was no long-term financial strategy. No one was telling him to invest in stocks, bonds, or real estate. His entire financial world was managed by his father, Vernon, a man with no financial training, and overseen by Colonel Parker, a man whose only goal was to maximize his own commission on the current deal. Elvis was surrounded by people who were either financially incompetent or had a massive conflict of interest. So, when he died, there was not much left. He owned Graceland, he owned his personal belongings, he had some cash in the bank, and he had the rights to the songs he recorded after the 1973 RCA deal, which were not his most valuable ones. It was a surprisingly small portfolio for the biggest star in the world. The empire was an illusion. It was a house of cards propped up by his constant touring in the final years. When he died, the income stopped and the house of cards collapsed. What are the biggest unanswered questions about his final net worth? Is it possible that there were hidden assets or bank accounts that were never discovered? How much cash exactly did he have on hand at the time of his death? Did he have any outstanding personal loans or debts that were not officially recorded? And if he had lived for another 5 years with his declining health and continued spending, would he have declared bankruptcy? Number 6, did his divorce cost him more than just his marriage? Elvis and Priscilla Presley separated in 1972, and their divorce was finalized in 1973. By all accounts, it was an amicable split. They remained close friends. The financial settlement at the time was seen as relatively modest for a star of his stature, but it was another significant financial blow at a time when he could ill afford it. The settlement included a one-time cash payment of $725,000. He also had to pay her spousal and child support. He gave her 5% of the stock in his music publishing companies, and he had to pay off a loan on a house she had bought in Beverly Hills. The total value of the settlement was around $1,500,000. In today's money, that is about $10 million. This was a major expense, and it came right at the time when he needed a large sum of cash. This is one of the key reasons that he and Colonel Parker decided to make the deal to sell his back catalog to RCA. The divorce settlement created a cash flow crisis, and selling his future royalties was the quick fix. So you can draw a direct line from the divorce to one of the worst business decisions of his career. The cost of the divorce was not just the $1,500,000 settlement, it was the chain reaction it set off. Priscilla, in her book Elvis and Me, makes it clear that she did not want to take him to the cleaners. Her lawyers had advised her she could get much more, but she wanted to keep things friendly for the sake of their daughter, Lisa Marie. Even so, the amount was significant. It was another large hole in a very leaky financial bucket. The settlement also highlights once again the lack of sophisticated financial planning. There was no prenuptial agreement. When they married in 1967, Elvis was already a global superstar. A modern celebrity would have had an ironclad prenup, but this was not something that was commonly done at the time, and it was certainly not something that Colonel Parker, with his old-fashioned ways, would have pushed for. The financial impact was not just the money he paid out, it was also the emotional toll. The divorce was a personal blow to Elvis. Many observers, including those in his inner circle, point to the period after the divorce as the beginning of his final steep decline in health. He was lonely and depressed. This likely led to even more erratic behavior and impulsive spending as a way to cope with his unhappiness. So the cost of the divorce was threefold. There was the direct financial cost of the settlement. There was the indirect financial cost of the disastrous RCA catalog sale, which was done to pay for it. And there was the personal cost, which had its own unquantifiable but very real financial consequences. What are the things we still don't know for sure? How much more could Priscilla have legally demanded in the divorce settlement under California law at the time? Were Elvis's assets accurately valued during the divorce proceedings? Did Colonel Parker try to influence the settlement negotiations in any way to protect his own income stream? And how much of Elvis's spending in his final years can be directly attributed to the depression and loneliness he felt after the marriage ended? At number 5, was he trapped in a financial cage built by his own manager? The relationship between Elvis Presley and Colonel Tom Parker is one of the most debated in music history. Was Parker a brilliant manager who made Elvis a star, or a manipulative con man who exploited him? The truth is, he was probably both. But when it comes to finances, it is hard to see the relationship as anything other than a trap. From the very beginning, Parker asserted total control. He was not just a manager. He was the sole and exclusive representative for Elvis in all matters. He controlled the record deals, the movie deals, the television appearances, and the merchandising. Elvis had no other business advisors. He had no independent lawyer reviewing his contracts. Everything went through the Colonel. This absolute control created a massive conflict of interest. Parker's primary goal was to make money for himself. His 50% commission meant that his interests were often, but not always, aligned with Elvis's. For example, he pushed for the quick, cheap movies because they were easy money for him, even though they were bad for Elvis's career and soul. He pushed for the RCA catalog sale because it gave him a huge, immediate commission, even though it was a terrible long-term deal for Elvis. One of the most significant and strangest aspects of Parker's control was his refusal to let Elvis tour internationally. Elvis was a global superstar. He had millions of fans in Europe, Asia, and South America. A world tour in the 1960s or 70s would have been a massive financial windfall. But it never happened. Elvis never performed a concert outside of North America after he became a star. Why? The reason is revealed in Alana Nash's definitive biography, The Colonel. Parker was not actually Tom Parker. He was Andreas van Kooik, an illegal immigrant from the Netherlands. He had no passport and could not leave the United States because he feared he would not be allowed back in. His own personal legal situation directly limited Elvis's earning potential. He sacrificed millions of dollars in potential income for Elvis to protect his own secret. This is perhaps the most damning evidence of how his control hurt Elvis financially. He put his own needs far ahead of his clients. Elvis was trapped. By the time he was old enough and famous enough to question the arrangement, he was too deep in. Parker had been with him from the beginning. He was a father figure, and Elvis was loyal. He was also not a businessman. He hated confrontations about money, so he let the Colonel handle everything, even when he suspected things were not right. The members of the Memphis Mafia have recounted stories of Elvis complaining about the Colonel, but he never took the step of firing him. The cage was not just financial, it was psychological. Parker had created a system of dependency. Elvis needed the Colonel to run the business so he could be the artist, but the business was run in a way that kept Elvis constantly working, constantly on a treadmill, just to maintain the lifestyle Parker had helped create. It was a vicious cycle, and Elvis was at the center of it, a prisoner in his own golden kingdom. What are the unanswered questions about this strange relationship? Was Elvis legally able to fire Colonel Parker, or were their contracts so ironclad that he was stuck? Did Elvis ever secretly consult with another manager or lawyer to explore his options? How much money, in today's dollars, did Elvis lose by not touring internationally? And was Parker's 50% commission legally enforceable, or could it have been challenged in court as unconscionable? Number 4, who benefited more from Elvis, Elvis or the IRS? It is a grim joke, but for much of his career, you could argue that Elvis Presley's most consistent financial partner was the Internal Revenue Service. He earned a tremendous amount of money, and he paid a tremendous amount in taxes. This was a simple consequence of his high income and the tax laws at the time. But the way his finances were structured, or rather not structured, made the tax burden much worse than it needed to be. During the peak of his career in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the top marginal income tax rate in the United States was very high. For a time in the late 50s and early 60s, it was over 90%. Even in the 70s, it was 70%. This means that for every dollar Elvis earned over a certain amount, the federal government took the majority of it. When you combine this with state and local taxes, it is easy to see how a huge chunk of his income was immediately gone. A sophisticated financial advisor today would use a variety of legal strategies to minimize that tax burden. They would set up corporations, trusts, and retirement accounts. They would find ways to defer income and maximize deductions. Elvis had none of this. His business structure was incredibly simple. Money came in, it was split with the colonel, and then he paid personal income tax on his share. The lack of corporate structure was a major problem. As an individual, he could not take advantage of the tax benefits available to a corporation. All of his massive expenses, from the entourage to Graceland's upkeep, were harder to justify as business expenses when he was just an individual earning a salary. As detailed in financial analyses of his estate, this simple structure, favored by Colonel Parker for its simplicity, cost Elvis millions in taxes over the years. There were also specific tax problems. The 1973 RCA catalog sale, for example, resulted in a huge one-time capital gain. This lump sum was taxed heavily. If he had continued to receive royalties, it would have been spread out over many years, likely resulting in a lower overall tax bill. After his death, the tax problems became a crisis for his estate. The IRS conducted an audit and claimed that the estate owed a massive inheritance tax. Their argument was that the value of Elvis's name and likeness was a taxable asset. This was a new and controversial legal argument at the time. The initial bill was over $10 million, a sum the nearly broke estate could not possibly pay. This tax battle is a major part of the story of how Priscilla Presley had to save the estate. They eventually settled with the IRS, but the fight almost destroyed what was left of his fortune. So, while Elvis was alive, he lost a huge percentage of his income to taxes due to poor planning. And after he was dead, the IRS came after his legacy. He was a cash cow for the U.S. Treasury, but much of that could have been avoided with better financial advice. What are the things we still don't know for sure? What was the exact percentage of his lifetime earnings that Elvis paid in taxes? Did his father, Vernon, ever hire a tax specialist to try and reduce the burden, and was that advice ignored? How did Colonel Parker handle his own tax situation with his 50% share? And if a modern financial team had managed Elvis's career, how much more money could he have legally sheltered from taxes? Number 3. Why didn't the king of rock and roll own anything but his kingdom? Elvis Presley's net worth was tied up almost entirely in one thing: himself. His ability to sing, perform, and be Elvis was his only real asset. He had almost no diversified investments. He did not own a portfolio of stocks and bonds. He did not own an empire of real estate. He did not invest in other businesses. All of his financial eggs were in the Elvis Presley basket. This is one of the most baffling aspects of his financial story. A person with his level of income would typically be advised to diversify their wealth. The idea is simple: do not rely on a single source of income. If that one source dries up, you have others to fall back on. Financial planners would have told him to take a portion of his earnings and invest it in the stock market, in real estate, and other businesses. This would have created a nest egg that would grow over time, independent of his career. This never happened. The money he earned from movies and records was spent on his lifestyle, not invested. The concept of building a diversified portfolio was completely foreign to his management team. While Colonel Parker was a promoter, not an investment advisor, his focus was on the next deal, the next concert, the next paycheck. He did not have the skills or the interest to manage a long-term investment strategy. Vernon Presley, who signed the checks, was also not a sophisticated investor. He was focused on managing the household bills, so Elvis's financial security depended entirely on his ability to keep working. When he was young and healthy, this was not a problem. The money flowed freely. But as he got older and his health declined, it became a huge risk. He had to keep performing even when he was sick and exhausted because he had no other significant source of income to pay his massive bills. He had no passive income from investments. His only income was active income, and he was the one who had to be active. Think about other major stars. Frank Sinatra had numerous business investments. Johnny Carson, the host of The Tonight Show, became incredibly wealthy through his production company and other investments he made on the advice of his business manager. Elvis had the same level of fame and income, but none of the financial infrastructure behind it. His only major asset was Graceland, and as we have discussed, it was a liability during his lifetime. His other assets were depreciating, things like cars and jets. They lost value over time. He was not buying assets that would appreciate like stocks or commercial real estate. He was buying consumer goods on a massive scale. This lack of diversification is a direct result of the poor financial advice he received. He was surrounded by people who did not understand how to build and preserve wealth. They understood how to earn it and how to spend it, but not how to grow it. This left him incredibly vulnerable. When he died, the income stream stopped and his estate was left with a collection of personal belongings and a very expensive house, but very little in the way of income-generating assets. What are the lingering questions here? Was Elvis ever presented with a proposal to invest in stocks or other businesses, and did he turn it down? Did he have a personal interest in the stock market at all? How did his lack of investment compare to other major stars of his era? And what would his net worth have been at the time of his death if he had invested just 10% of his annual income into a simple S&P 500 index fund from 1956 onwards? Number 2, how could one man give away $500 million empire? The single most shocking and controversial fact about Elvis Presley's finances is Colonel Tom Parker's commission. He took 50% of almost everything Elvis ever earned. This is not a normal manager's fee. In the music industry, a manager's commission is typically between 10% and 20%. A 25% commission would be considered very high. A 50% commission is almost unheard of. It is the kind of split you would expect from a full business partner who is putting up half the capital and taking half the risk. But Parker was not a partner in that sense. He was a manager. This 50-50 split was established early on. The initial contracts were for a lower percentage, but it quickly escalated to 50%. Parker's justification was that he was more than a manager. He claimed he was a promoter, a strategist, and a partner who had created the Elvis phenomenon. In his mind, he deserved half, and Elvis, a young man from Memphis who was new to the business, agreed. He signed the contracts that 50% applied across the board. It was 50% of his record royalties. It was 50% of his movie salaries. It was 50% of his concert fees. It was 50% of the merchandising revenue. For over 20 years, for every dollar that came in the door with Elvis's name on it, 50 cents went to the Colonel before Elvis even saw it. This is a staggering amount of money. If Elvis earned $1 billion in today's money over his career, that means Colonel Parker earned $1 billion too. He became an incredibly wealthy man, all based on the talent and work of his one and only client. This arrangement is the central reason why Elvis's own take-home pay was so much smaller than it should have been. Many people tried to warn Elvis. Other managers, lawyers, and friends told him that Parker's commission was exorbitant. But Elvis remained loyal. The relationship was complex and deeply psychological. Parker had discovered him, had guided him, and in many ways had protected him in the early days. Elvis felt a sense of debt and loyalty that went beyond business. The legality of this arrangement has been questioned. After Elvis's death, the estate, under the guidance of Priscilla Presley, sued Colonel Parker. The lawsuit, filed in 1981, alleged that Parker had violated his fiduciary duty to his client and that the 50% commission was unconscionable. The case was eventually settled out of court. Parker, gave up any future claim on Elvis's earnings in exchange for a lump sum payment. But the settlement was a tacit admission that the management arrangement had been, at the very least, highly questionable. The 50% commission is the foundation of Elvis's financial problems. It cut his potential wealth in half from the start. Combined with high taxes and his own extravagant spending, it created a perfect storm of financial instability. He was the biggest star in the world, but he was only getting to keep a fraction of what he earned, perhaps as little as 10 or 15 cents on the dollar after the Colonel and the IRS took their shares. It is a number that is still hard to comprehend. What are the final shocking questions about this deal? Was the 50% contract from the 1950s even legally valid for the entire duration of his career, or should it have been renegotiated? Are there any other major artists in history who had a similar arrangement with their manager? How much money did Colonel Parker himself actually end up with after his own expenses and taxes? And what would Elvis's life and career have looked like if he had a manager who only took a standard 15%? Number one, was Colonel Tom Parker a genius or a con artist? This is the ultimate question that hangs over the entire story of Elvis Presley's life and finances. It is a question with no easy answer. The truth is that Colonel Tom Parker was a complex figure who was likely both a genius and a con artist, often at the same time. The case for genius is strong, especially in the early years. Parker was a brilliant promoter. He took a raw talent from Memphis and, through a masterful campaign of television appearances, radio play, and publicity, turned him into the biggest star in the world. The early TV strategy, culminating in the appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, was revolutionary. He understood the power of the new medium of television better than anyone. He created a national phenomenon. He secured the groundbreaking record deal with RCA. He made Elvis a movie star. He created the merchandising blueprint. In the 1950s, his vision and hustle were unparalleled. He made Elvis Presley, but the case for him being a con artist is equally, if not more, compelling. It is built on a foundation of greed and deception. The 50% commission is the primary evidence. It was a level of exploitation that is shocking even by the standards of the rough and tumble early days of rock and roll. His decision to put Elvis in a decade of terrible, formulaic movies stifled his artistic growth. It was a safe financial move for Parker, but a creative disaster for Elvis. His refusal to allow an international tour, all to protect his own secret identity as an illegal immigrant, cost Elvis millions of dollars and the chance to connect with his global fan base. The sale of the back catalog to RCA in 1973 for a fraction of its worth was a clear case of prioritizing his own short-term gain over his client's long-term financial health. His control was absolute. He fostered a sense of dependency in Elvis. He kept him isolated from other business advisors. He built a world where he was the only source of financial information and guidance. This allowed him to operate without oversight or accountability. The man who managed the biggest star in the world was himself a mystery, an unregistered alien with a fabricated past and a name that was not his own. In the end, the legacy is mixed, but the financial verdict is clear. While Parker's early genius created the opportunity for immense wealth, his later greed and self-interest were the primary reasons that wealth was squandered. He built the empire, and then he looted it. He created a star who could earn $1 billion, but he structured the business in such a way that the star himself would see very little of it and be left on a treadmill of constant work just to stay afloat. The story of Elvis's finances is a cautionary tale. It is a story of what happens when incredible talent is paired with questionable management. It shows that it is not how much you earn that matters, but how much you keep and how you manage it. Elvis earned more than almost anyone in his generation, but he was not in control of his own financial destiny. That control belonged to a man who saw him not as a partner, but as a product. A product from which he could extract a 50% profit. So, what are the final unanswered questions that define this whole saga? If Colonel Parker had died in 1960, would Elvis have become an even bigger and wealthier star under different management? Did Parker truly believe he was acting in Elvis's best interest, or was he knowingly and cynically exploiting him from the start? What was the true nature of their personal relationship, beyond the contracts and the money? And ultimately, who was the bigger prisoner, Elvis, trapped by his fame, and his manager, or the Colonel, a man trapped in a country he could never leave, hiding a past that could never be revealed? The music is eternal, but the financial story behind it is one of a kingdom built on a shaky foundation, ruled by a king who was never truly in charge.